it's, you know, the system is, it's a distribution system. The people with money get food, the people without money starve. And no matter how much food there is, if you don't have money, you're not getting any food. And this had the, you know, the effect of making it harder for farmers to stay in business because it required more money to buy all the fertilizer, to buy the machines. It enabled successful farmers to buy up the land around them, and it ended up increasing poverty. And so you end up having really the growth of these giant slum cities. And at the same time, NGOs start funding these population growth initiatives. So really kind of pushing family planning and various methods for doing this. In Puerto Rico, by the end of 1990, 42% of the women of childbearing age had been sterilized. Many of them involuntarily. Most of them were not told what it actually meant. They thought, oh, okay, well, I'll be able to choose when I have my child instead of just getting pregnant forever. Like, no, it's done. You're never having a child again. That, for me, is one of the sickest statistics I've ever heard. You know, almost half the women who could have children no longer are capable of doing so. And this wasn't just, you know, it's not just Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is where the experimentation went on, where the United States would do things to see what would happen and then export that elsewhere. In some places, the people fought back. Many years ago, we brought or my school brought a Bolivian peasant organizer up to our university, and the story she was telling is that these couple of people in the Peace Corps were going around pushing this family planning stuff on people, and the peasants kind of rose up and did to them what they were doing to everybody else, gelded them, which, you know, I find horrifying at one level, but, you know. You know.
I'm sorry, turn around this fair play.
Excuse me for a second.
Just one thing. I was a social worker in Spanish Harlem in the 60s, and when Puerto Rican women would give birth at Metropolitan Hospital, they were automatically sterilized. Yeah. And this was in the 60s in New York.
Yeah. It wasn't just Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
They did it to people to women who they felt were not mentally capable of taking care of their children. They did it to American Indians. They did it to black women. You know, it just, I mean, that policy alone was kind of widespread in the United States at one point. And even, from what I understand, it did not end until the 1980s, which for me, that's when I was in high school. So for me, that's not that long a time ago. On May 21st in Washington, these NGOs are often used to directly support our imperial agenda. So on May 21st in Washington, Andrew Natsios, the head of USAID, gave a speech blasting US NGOs for failing to play a role many of them didn't realize they had been assigned, doing public relations for the United States government. According to Interaction, the network of 160 relief and development NGOs that hosted the conference, Mr. Natsios was irritated that starving and sick Iraqi and Afghan children didn't realize their food and vaccines were coming to them courtesy of George Bush. And from now on, NGOs had better do a better job of linking their humanitarian assistance to U.S. foreign policy and making it clear that they are an arm of the U.S. government. If they didn't, Interaction reported, Natsios threatened to personally tear up their contracts and find new partners. NGO funding has also been responsible for the increase in religious fundamentalism, the growth of religious fundamentalism throughout the world. In Israel, or in Palestine, occupied Palestine, the Israeli government funded what ended up becoming Hamas. And while, of course, you know, I strongly support Palestinian right of self-determination, how they choose to struggle against their occupiers, prior to that time, that struggle had been led by socialists and secular secular groups. starting in the late 1970s and 1980s, that became dominated more and more by right-wing religious zealots. The same is true in India, where what's called Hindu nationalism, which is various groups that are aligned around a kind of very right-wing version of the Hindu religion. You may have heard stories about them burning down Hindu mosques. Part of the reason why they're at war in Kashmir, and this right-wing religious revival in India. In Latin America, we see it with the rise of evangelicalism, Christian evangelism. It's traditionally a Catholic country, and this happened at almost the same time that liberation theology began to spread throughout Latin America. And so the dictator, for example, the dictator in Guatemala was a right-wing Christian evangelist, and more we're seeing this throughout Latin America. And we see it in other ways with, for example, feminist organizations supporting imperial wars. So we have to be in Afghanistan to save the women from the Taliban, although the current government is scarcely better, and in some ways is worse because, at least under the Taliban there wasn't any rape, although
you can get raped in your own house.
Right. I mean, it's a bad situation all around. But also, NGOs were calling for intervention in Yugoslavia because of the so-called rape camps, evidence of which has yet to be found. But everybody heard about it. We've got to go there and save them. In my university, one of my Marxist professors, with even talking about these things, they did a very good job of kind of snowballing us. And really, I mean, it kind of comes back to is that, these foundations, the government, this money gives them control over us. During the Civil Rights Movement, the groups that were really independent of the foundations were able to go farther and do more and push the agenda more. Most of them were based on churches because the church had its own independent money base. The Black Panthers also had their own had their own money. CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, got sucked up into this trap. They were originally an anti-capitalist organization. They started talking about black power, and the Ford Foundation approached them with a program in the city of Cleveland. They were like, we're going to identify certain black leaders in the community. We're going to show them what capitalism is really all about. Brought them to these seminars in hopes that, the official reason was to kind of, to forestall an outbreak of violence, which didn't happen. There were riots that summer anyway. But over the intervening years, the politics of that organization, the Congress of Racial Equality, ended up supporting black capitalism as opposed to black revolution. Ended up supporting, that, and although they had an officially militant stance, less and less they were opposed to the system, more and more about getting a piece of the pie. We saw this last year with ACORN. And this funding actually makes these groups pretty fragile, since they don't. There are very tight controls put on how the money can be spent, on who the money can be spent on, and if it's pulled away, the group can disappear overnight. ACORN, as soon as the U.S. government pulled the funding on ACORN, it collapsed. I think there's still a branch out in Los Angeles, but that's pretty much it. There used to be one up here in Fort Lauderdale, and I don't know where else, but everything. I almost had a job with ACORN myself back in Chicago. There's a group called Incite, Women of Color, which is a very radical women of color organization. And they really kind of kick-started this whole questioning of NGOs and the not-for-profit complex, because they were putting together a program for a grant for about $100,000, went to the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation gave them the money. And then somebody went and checked their website, found out that Incite was actually opposed to the occupation of Palestine, and they pulled the money. And Incite had to scramble really fast because they were dependent on the money. They actually managed to raise it and continue on, but then after that they're like, well, what is this thing that we've gotten tangled into? But